of the Mask. So we are going to review this What's at Stake video. So let me just get this up in front of us, move this to the beginning. All right, hold on one second and get back to my screen. Okay. We're going to go to Lydia. Okay, so here's the bottom line. So Lydia has written a book called The Mirror or the Mask, and she's a professor. She's has a PhD. She's actually done a lot of research on the mirror or the mask for the mirror or the mask, which is covering the New Testament and covering another number of very interesting topics. And one of the things that she's doing as a rather conservative Christian scholar is she's refuting some of the claims of what I would say are more liberal scholars, people who've taken the stance that the gospel authors have taken a lot of have used a lot of literary devices to try to craft a narrative that fits in with this greater picture. And so she's basically saying that, no, God is in the details. A lot of the details which these people are essentially writing off, Lydia is saying, no, you can't just write these off. In fact, there are many cases where the Bible seems to have a contradiction. There are a few cases where people would claim that there might be contradictions, but after further study and looking into the Bible, they realize that actually there are no provable contradictions in the New Testament or the Old Testament. I've yet to find either. And people can reconcile many of the situations where people claim there are contradictions. And so as an example of that, people tried to make the claim that there are two accounts of Judas hanging himself and falling. Okay, so there are two accounts of Judas's death. Judas Iscariot is the one who, of course, betrayed Jesus, and he committed suicide on the same morning that Jesus was tried. Okay, so on the Friday morning of the Passion Week, Judas committed suicide. In one account of Judas's suicide, we know that he hanged himself. In a second account, we know that he fell headlong. Now, how do you reconcile those two accounts? Well, of course, he hanged himself and then he fell headlong. Okay, and so when he fell, perhaps he fell down one of those big cliffs that's present all over the place in the place where he did hang himself. And he ended up falling head first. In a way, he could have hung himself in different ways. He could have just sort of rolled down the hill in different ways where he ended up being head first. There's a number of different ways that he could have had this happen. And so another issue that relates to that is also, of course, when he did that, his whole guts exploded. So that tends to happen with rigor mortis. In other words, that's one of the biggest supposed contradictions that I've heard from atheists, and yet it really isn't a contradiction at all. So now we're going to take a look at what Lydia has to say about some others. So let's go ahead and listen here. Let me bring up the sound so we can hear this. Share computer sound. Okay, so here we go.
In this last video of our series, I want to talk about what I'll call the big picture about the big picture. Here's what I mean. You'll often hear Dr. Michael Licona, the literary device theorist, talk about the gist of the story or the big picture, the essence of the story. And the idea is that if the gospel authors altered some things, it's really not important as long as they did not alter what these scholars believe to be the big picture or the essence of Jesus' message or something of that kind. What is the biggest big picture event in the Gospels that's recorded in the Gospels? What do we Christians, I think, agree is the biggest big picture event? And I think we would agree that it's the resurrection of Jesus. Now, the resurrection of Jesus is at the center of Dr. Licona's own ministry. His ministry is called Risen Jesus, and he debates skeptics defending the resurrection. And that's a great thing. But unfortunately, the compositional device theories tend to call into question the resurrection accounts that we find in the Gospels. We can see this back in his 2010 book, which was on the resurrection of Jesus, called A New Historiographical Approach. And here was what he said about the resurrection accounts in the Gospels. We have resisted the temptation to employ sources of uncertain value, as well as potential facts that would certainly bolster the resurrection hypothesis, RH. In our assessment of the relevant sources in terms of their ability to yield valuable data for our investigation, we noted that the resurrection narratives in the canonical Gospels may be useful. However, because of unknowns, such as the amount of liberty the evangelists may have taken in their reports, as well as the sharp disagreement among scholars pertaining to their reliability, we have chosen to use them only when necessary and to rely more heavily on earlier sources about which more is known, and a greater agreement exists within a heterogeneous majority of scholars.
You see, I think that this idea here that the evangelists, the people, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, decided that they were going to take liberties is preposterous. Okay. When I listened to this, I was absolutely disgusted, because I feel like, think about it this way. Now, I do have a presupposition that they believed in God. And I also have a presupposition that they strongly believed in God and they wouldn't want to do anything that would go against what God would want. So taking liberties to craft a narrative is something that would not be consistent with anyone who truly believes in God and understands this idea of the fear of God. I mean, imagine what how God would react if somebody's trying to craft a narrative, a fake narrative, or try to bolster the story and make it bring it out in a different way than it really happened. Now, we know that there are what they call a lot of embarrassing occurrences in the Gospels. The Gospel authors did not exclude those because they weren't trying to craft a narrative. For example, the fact that the family of Jesus tried to stop his ministry and thought he was crazy is clearly an embarrassment. The fact that Jesus was crucified is an embarrassment. Crucifixion was one of the most gory forms of death that they had back then, and it was meant for the lowest sort of people. It was typically given to the slaves. People were beaten. They were forced to carry their own crosses. It was humiliating. They were made naked. All of those sorts of things were included in the gospel. So if the gospel authors had this idea that they wanted to craft this fake narrative, we certainly don't see it. Okay. We don't see any evidence of that. Instead, we have evidence of all sorts of little embarrassing things. Even Jesus saying to others, you think of, because Jesus is a drinker, or Jesus drank, comparing him to John the Baptist, he was looking at different things like that, where people might say, oh my gosh, whoa. So they didn't try to exclude anything, and they certainly wouldn't start including a number of things that aren't consistent with the actual story. Now, Lydia does a really good job of going through this in her book, The Mirror or the Mask. So I highly encourage you watch that. But let's see what next she has to say.
As we've seen, the compositional device theories as applied to the resurrection narratives are very consistent with this generalization, this analysis that we don't know how much liberty the evangelists might have felt free to take, and it's possible that they took quite a bit. Here again are just some facts that are recounted in the accounts that there are allegations of change. First of all, that Luke altered the time, place, and manner of Jesus' first appearance to his group of disciples, moving it from Galilee to Jerusalem, and thereby changing the circumstances rather importantly. This would even make it difficult to fit in the Doubting Thomas sequence. Second, that Luke altered the words of the angel at the tomb to remove a reference to a meeting in Galilee because he was going to move that meeting to Jerusalem and replace it with a different reference to Galilee, that Jesus foretold these things when he was in Galilee. Third, Matthew or John altering the circumstances quite radically in which Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. A fourth one that I haven't mentioned heretofore in this video series is the idea that in his first meeting with his disciples, John invented what I might call the sub-incident where Jesus breathes and he says, receive the Holy Ghost. And whoever sins you forgive, they are forgiven, and so forth. The idea is that that was John's replacement for Pentecost, that John was not going to narrate Pentecost, and he put this in instead.
I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that she mentioned. So I'm going to talk about what we know as far as Jesus's appearance. Now, number one, we know that he appeared to his disciples in a period of 40 days. Okay, some of these people who are these very liberal scholars have taken this they have this notion that that Jesus either went to Galilee first or he went to Jerusalem first. But the text actually gives us the answer to that. The text tells us quite clearly what happened, and the text tells us even the order in which Jesus appeared to his disciples. For example, we can go right to 1 Corinthians 15 and see what Paul received. For what I received, I passed on to you of first importance. Okay, this is telling us, the readers, that Paul received something from other people, and this is a memorized creed. This is actually the earliest creed from within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion that had been memorized. I passed on to you of first importance that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas. Okay, he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. So we know that there was a separate appearance to Peter. Okay. Now, if you go to the Gospels and you look at Matthew, Mark, and John, you're going to see that they don't make mention of this second appearance to Peter. However, in the book of Luke, we do see that Jesus had appeared to Peter separately, because when the two people who were on the road to Emmaus met up with the disciples in the house in which they had been hiding at one point, those two people, suddenly Jesus appeared to all of them. But the disciples reported to those two people, including Cleopas was one of them, reported to those two people that Jesus had appeared to to Peter. So here's what we know. We could even start with why Paul didn't mention that he appeared to Mary Magdalene first, is because it was a society in which men's testimonies were revered and female testimonies were not. So this memorized creed came in without the females being the first to be mentioned. However, that's one of those little embarrassing facts that the gospel authors chose to retain. So we can go back to look at the four gospels and see if we can put these together and make sense of it. We know that Jesus first appeared to Mary Magdalene. Okay. He first appeared to her. Then he appeared to Peter. It sounds like he appeared to the women, and he appeared to all of the disciples. Okay, so then he appeared, eventually he appeared to the 500, he appeared to James, Jesus' half-brother, and then he appeared to Paul, as he calls himself the one abnormally born. So Jesus made a number of different appearances in a number of different places. We also know that at one point he appeared in the house. He was able to get through the house into the doors without having to walk through the door like normal people. His body just sort of appeared in the house and also disappeared. We know that that occurred, and that's in Jerusalem. And then we also know that he made another appearance in Galilee. Now, how do we know which appearance of those two that he made first? Well, we know because the Gospels tell us in John 20:19 that the disciples were in hiding when Jesus appeared to them. Okay, so we know that this was on Sunday night, according to Luke, and we know that from the road to Emmaus, that they were still in hiding, and Jesus appeared to them in the house. Okay, so Jesus made an appearance to them, and so that's something that we know. We also know that they came out of hiding eventually. They had a lot of strength with the Pentecost, and they were given strength with the Pentecost, but they also came out of hiding and started to see Jesus in a number of different places. For example, John it was with Peter. They were on a boat fishing. They had a really bad day fishing, and they saw Jesus appear to them and tell them where to cast the net. They cast the net out, and they got 153 fish that day. So we have a number of different times Jesus actually appeared to them in Galilee, appeared to them in Jerusalem. He appeared to single groups, single people. He appeared to groups of people. He ate with them. He was present for 40 days, and then he rose up. He ascended into heaven. At that point, during the Pentecost, what's really interesting is that was the point when the Great Commission went out, when the disciples were told that they had to go out to all ends of the earth. Now, if we go back to Psalm 82 and some of the stuff that Michael Heiser's written on this kind of thing, we know that the disciples decided to go out, and in every land they went to, they were reclaiming the land for Christ. Everything had been given to Christ following the resurrection. He was given power over all. All right, so so all land was reclaimed in his name. Okay, so let's go back to what Dr. McGrew has to say here. And I want to say hi to people in the audience. I am monitoring the chat. Okay, actually SD4, I want to say that the supposed contradiction relates to how many women were at the tomb. Well, we have different reports of which person the person who was writing paid attention to. For example, if I talked about a football game and I said, boy, Tom Brady really did a great job in the football game, and I only made mention of Tom Brady, The assumption isn't that Tom Brady is the only one playing the game. It was just that I felt that he was very important or integral to who won the football game. In the same way, when these disciples make mention of how many women went with, we know that a group of women went. Okay, a group of women went to the tomb. We also know that they went at different times. They went to and fro, to the tomb. First, the women appeared to the tomb. The angels told them not to be afraid, that Jesus has risen. We see that in Mark. Then the women left the tomb, told the disciples what they found was an empty tomb. Then some of them returned to the tomb. So they were going back and forth. And so a lot of people try to freeze those accounts and try to claim that they only went to the tomb once. However, that's not even in the Gospels. You have to read those pretty carefully, and you'll find that there were multiple times when they went back and forth from the tomb. Okay, so let's go back to Dr. McGrew.
And that is something that Dr. Licona suggests quite strongly that John did in his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? Now, with all of these potential changes to the resurrection accounts on the table, I think we can fairly ask some questions. Let's consider those who originally claimed to be witnesses of the resurrection, the disciples, the women who went to the tomb, and so forth. Did those original alleged witnesses even claim that Jesus ate with them? That's recorded in a couple of the Gospels, but did that really happen? Did they even claim it? Did they even claim that Jesus met with them for long conversations, during which they were in groups and he was talking to them for a long period of time, repeatedly? That's pretty clear in the Gospels. Did they claim that they could touch him? Did they claim that he invited them to touch him? Did they claim that they met him in groups of different sizes, under different circumstances, indoors and outdoors, over a period of weeks? Was the skeptical Thomas then later convinced that Jesus was raised from the dead because he saw him? Was this something that they even claimed? Or is even the claim that they made these claims more than what historians can attest to, going beyond the historical data and so forth? My husband Tim and I wrote an article on the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. It was published in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology in 2009. In that article, we made a resurrection of Jesus, and what we took as sort of the basis, the facts to be explained, was the idea that the original alleged witnesses at least made these claims. And then we argued that it's very difficult to explain that on any hypothesis other than the literal physical resurrection of Jesus. But we made it clear then, and we've been consistent ever since, that the details of the claims are important. Particularly the physical details and the length of time and the fact that they were in groups, all these kinds of things are important to the strength of the case. This leads us to a pretty serious issue and what we might call a paradox. If we say that the gospel authors cared only about the big picture, we may put ourselves in a position where we can't even defend the big picture. God, as the saying goes, is in the details. This leads us to another point. When it comes to our lives as Christians and our work as Christian ministers, pastors, counselors, that kind of thing, do we need more than just a big, broad picture for our churches and for our lives as Christians? Now, I think it's obvious that we do. When you're a pastor, suppose you get up on a Sunday morning, do you just preach? If you're preaching on the Gospels, an expository sermon, do you just preach on the biggest gist of the incident, or also on the details of the incident? Well, I think you preach on both, obviously. So, for example, you might not just preach on the crucifixion, general, so on the specifics. So, for example, that Jesus said, "I thirst, and it is finished," from the cross, and that he was really suffering in that way, and that's why he said, "I thirst." And you would draw out the implications that these have for theology and for who Jesus was and for his victory over death. Might you preach on the fact that the disciples were squabbling about who would be the greatest in the kingdom on the very night in which Jesus was betrayed. Of course you might, because there's a kind of irony to that on that very important night, they were fighting about such a trivial thing, and then Jesus washed their feet, and he rebuked them as well. Well, in Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, Dr. Lacona suggests very strongly that Luke may well have moved that squabble from a different incident and put it into the context of the Last Supper. When you're comforting the bereaved, do you tell them that Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live? Well, of course, I certainly hope you do. Okay. Well, Dr. Craig Evans has strongly suggested that the I am sayings with predicates such as I am the resurrection and life are historically dubious, that these might be creations of the community that created the Gospel of John.
Which I would say is, again, another ludicrous thing. So imagine the guts it would take for somebody to actually to posit this idea, because again, John included all sorts of embarrassing testimonies. All of them included a lot of embarrassing testimonies. And the fact that that we have this wonderful statements from Jesus, I am the bread of life. No one gets to the Father except through the Son. These are quite clearly made from Jesus. They were attributed to Jesus. The author wrote them and said that Jesus said them. The author also at the very end of John made it quite clear that everything he wrote is true. So to say that what he wrote was made up or there's fiction that was added in there is just ridiculous. So anyway.
That would call into question what you're telling these bereaved people. I think we definitely should not be telling pastors that it doesn't matter. I think that would be condescending. A good shepherd wants to feed his flock on facts, on actual historical facts, and tell them the truth. When you're doing marital counseling, or maybe you're counseling someone who's already been divorced, do you tell him that Matthew, in his gospel, accurately records that Jesus said divorce is not permitted except for fornication? That's sometimes called the exception clause. That is recorded only in Matthew. Well, evangelical New Testament scholars Robert Stein and Dan Wallace have theorized that Jesus never said that Matthew inserted that as something that he believed Jesus would say, or that he believed was consistent with Jesus' other teaching.
People do all sorts of things when they're trying to make a claim that they don't agree with. Maybe they don't like the idea that Jesus said that about divorce. Perhaps these people had gotten divorced and they wanted to have their own pardon. So in their minds, they decided that this is something crafted just by Matthew. If you want to find out Jesus's treatment of a lot of different things, you have to take into account what's in the Gospels and what's written by people like Paul and Peter and James and Jude. If you look at all of this stuff and you put it together, sure, there's some stuff that is pretty uncomfortable. I mean, there is stuff in what Paul's written in the book of Romans concerning homosexuality that make people feel pretty uncomfortable. However, you can't just write it off as if it's not there. Paul said it, and Paul made it quite clear that everything that he wrote down, God gave him. Okay. Paul said he did not get this from man. He got it from God. He got the words that he wrote from God. The same thing probably applied to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, Matthew, we know, was a tax collector. He spent a few years with Jesus, traveling with him. And I hardly think that Matthew would start crafting narratives of his own. That's another one that a lot of people like to talk about, is they talk about what happens with when Jesus was crucified and when he died, he gave up the ghost, that the saints came to life and many people saw them. Now, simply because we don't have any other books or writings that are from the ancient times that confirm that, we don't have a secondary source that tell us that, some people have written that off as if it didn't happen. However, that is actually in fulfillment of the scriptures. What did happen? It's in fulfillment of some of the verses in the Old Testament. And we also know, again, going back to John, I just want to quote exactly what John said. After he wrote everything he wrote, including those I am statements, he said, "This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know his testimony is true." Okay, so it doesn't say we know his testimony is true, and he included his own literary devices to spice it up for you. No, it didn't say that. It says we know his testimony is true. Wrote down. Now, also think about this. To write something down in ancient times was extremely expensive. Okay, so they had to choose their words very cautiously. They had to make sure that they were including the text, only the text, and no, superfluous information. Because again, the parchment on which they wrote was very It was very expensive to do that, very expensive process. And so again, let's not think that they're crafting these narratives and inserting stories and talking about the walking saints and that sort of thing that they're just making up. They wouldn't have the guts to do that. Okay, that's not even a possibility. So here we go.
Historically, Jesus didn't say that was Matthew's insertion. I think that could definitely make a practical difference to how much weight you placed on that exception clause if you thought that Jesus didn't really say it. When we meditate on the Gospels in our personal devotions, we often use aspects of the Gospels that are details of the narrative or of Jesus' teaching, specifics, what I might call specifics, and those are important. We apply those to our lives. We draw out implications of them. In his conclusion video, Dr. Licona mentioned some correspondence that he had with a reader who was helped by his work. I also receive unsolicited correspondence from readers who've been helped by my work. And one of these, a man named Charles Drennan of Memphis, gave me permission to talk a little bit about our correspondence. And he wrote to me to say that The Mirror or the Mask was helpful to him because of its robust defense of the historicity of Jesus' teaching. And he said how important he'd found the specifics of Jesus' teaching in his own personal spiritual life. Here's what he said. When I was in 6th grade, in Bible class, our teacher mentioned the unpardonable sin. I became terrified. Had I committed it? Could I commit it? Etc. The thought of the unforgivable sin haunted me for a long time. I'm not sure where I would be without the soul-comforting, anxiety-abolishing words of Jesus. John 6:44, no man can come to me except the Father which has sent me draw him. John 6:37, him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out. I'm sure all of us can recall similarly specific aspects of the Gospels and of the teaching of Jesus that have been very important to our personal spiritual lives. Yet I think we'd have to acknowledge that if we adopted the compositional device views, we'd have to put a question mark over a lot of those. And we'd have to be honest and say, I'm not sure that those historically really happened. It's good to remember that that big picture, that essence of who Jesus was and his message, does not exist in a Platonic realm, separated from concrete reality. Instead, it's built up of the specifics of concrete facts. So, for example, we know that Jesus was human from general scriptural teaching, but we also know it most importantly, from the specifics of the narrative. So, for example, he wept at the tomb of Lazarus. Well, that's a specific. It's recorded, in fact, only in John. We can say, well, if we didn't have this specific or that specific, we'd still have others. We'd still have a case that he was human. And that's true. It's a cumulative case. But at the same time, when you make a generalization about details versus the big picture, how many of these specifics then are called in question? So we know Jesus' humanity in part by his suffering cry on the cross, I thirst. Similarly, we know that he had victory over sin and over death and accomplished the work that he was set to accomplish by the Father by his cry from the cross, it is finished. As I mentioned in a previous video, the details of the Gospels are also important to the defense of the faith. Over the years, as Tim and I have been defending the reliability of the Gospels, we found numerous details that are confirmed in the Gospels, way too many to list possibly, but I will give a few of them here, just specific details that are confirmed. The grass was literally green at the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus literally asked Philip specifically, where can we buy bread so that these may eat? John the Baptist literally heard that voice from heaven, and that was why he said, as recorded in John, I saw and bore record that this is the Son of God, because the voice from heaven said that it was the Son of God. The temple had been being built for 46 years. When Jesus cleansed the temple early in his ministry, that's mentioned only in John, and it's a specific detail. When Joseph returned from the flight to Egypt with Mary and the baby Jesus, he was afraid to settle under the rule of Archelaus, the son of Herod the Great. That's confirmed by external evidence about what Archelaus had been doing right then and how he had slaughtered a bunch of people in Jerusalem. So that little detail of the infancy narrative is confirmed. And here's one I talked about on an earlier video for Emmanuel Fellowship. The name Simon was such a common name at the time and place that the events in the Gospels took place that if you named somebody Simon when you were telling a story, you had to have some other designation to say which Simon you were talking about. That's confirmed by name statistics. Those are small details.
I want to just, I want to back up really quickly and talk a little bit about the name statistics, because I actually played Peter Williams' video yesterday, and he went into great length about the name statistics. One of the things that's super interesting about the Bible is when you look at the names in the New Testament that were common during the ancient times, as determined by archaeology and other sources like that in history, we can find that the biblical names were quite consistent with what the expectations would be of popular big biblical names. For example, Simon was one of the most popular names, and its prevalence in the Bible fits that accordingly. And it is like what Lydia is saying, one of the things that they did was they would always include a qualifier on some of these more popular names. So it was Simon, we had Simon Peter, it could be, for example, another popular name, John. We have John the Baptist. We have John, the son of Zebedee. So we also have, so we have a couple of different Johns. We have James. We have several Jameses in the Gospels. And so again, we've got James the Just, James the brother of Jesus, James the son of Alphaeus, James the brother of John and son of Zebedee. So we've got different people out there, and they're always given qualifiers. What's really interesting is in the Gospels, what you're going to notice is a mention of a lot of minor characters. So for example, we know there were 6 Marys in the New Testament. Quite interestingly, Mary was a very common name for women back then. And the Marys always came with qualifiers too. But there were 6 Marys. And so one of the things that we find in this is in the Gospels, and this speaks to the early dating of the Gospels, the fact that in a lot of situations and events, very minor people in the events were named. Okay. One of the reasons that we can argue for earlier dating is because people tend to forget minor characters. If you think back in your own life, look back 20 years and think back to an event that you go to, are you going to be able to recall all of the people who were at that event? It's more likely you might just recall a couple of key figures that maybe made a difference to you in your life at that particular event. Okay, so think about that sort of thing. And so when they're recording a lot of these events over Jesus's 3 years, you'll notice that they include a lot of minor characters. Now, why I'm mentioning that is because when we go to the Gnostic Gospels, which were written quite later, okay, the Gnostic books, which are not part of the canon for good reasons, because they had become mythologized. But when that came about many years later, you'll notice that these minor characters were not included in that, speaking to the later dating of those books. Okay, so here we go. Let's go back to Lydia.
Many, many more. In fact, these give us a picture, we might say a big picture, of evangelists who were concerned about more than the big picture. It would be entirely fair to ask the scholars who have adopted these views whether they're going to provide help to Christian counselors, pastors, laymen, to make sure that they're basing their counseling and their ministry and their personal devotions upon the parts of the Gospels that are really historical rather than the parts of the Gospels that are not historical, that were changed. In fact, a mutual friend of mine and Dr. Lacona's, Tom Gilson, the editor of The Stream, has publicly asked this question. Are they going to provide help to pastors to make sure that when they preach, they're preaching on the real historical parts of the Gospels and not on the other parts? So far, such help has not been forthcoming. From my perspective, that's a good thing because it gives us time. It gives the church time to pause, to really absorb the magnitude of the shift that's being recommended here and to understand that, and then to ask whether that shift is justified. Now, I've argued at length and in detail that that shift is not justified. But I have not asked you just to take my word for it. I haven't just said, well, I'm Lydia McGrew, take my word for it. No, I've given specific arguments for it. I've also not asked anybody to reject these views out of hand because of a priori theological presuppositions. Instead, I've answered the arguments for this view and then provided arguments for a different view of the Gospels that I've dubbed the reportage model.
I want to say something really quickly with Lydia. I want to go back to something that she's talking about that I think has it needs a little bit more explanation. We could talk about this a little bit more. And I'm going to give an example from when I was in a PhD program. So I'm in a PhD program and I was starting to study expatriates. And I was looking at people who left the United States to work in foreign countries. And there was this thing called the expatriate failure rate. And the assertion was that the failure rate was around 25%. What that meant with 20% of people who went abroad to work for their companies were deciding that they had to come home early. Okay, so 25% had failed essentially in their, say, 3 to 4 year assignments, and they had to come home early. Many of them cited spouses. This number of 25% sort of stuck. And there was a woman called Ann Will Harzing, and she's an academic who wrote a paper. She did a little digging onto where exactly this 25% came from, because it suddenly was someone made the assertion that it's 25%. Another person used that person to back up the assertion as 25%. The other person used a second person to back it up. And so there's this so on chain of events occurring where everyone's relying on this one person who said 25%. Turns out the person who said 25% didn't have any backing for the 25%. Okay, it was just a number that this person had made up and it had carried. And unfortunately, because it was cited in an academic journal, everyone gave it credence. Okay, now why am I even talking about that? Well, I'm talking about that because I see the exact same thing happening for example, with what she's talking about in the New Testament. A lot of scholars out there are taking these very liberal views. And when one person has a liberal view, another person says, oh, okay, so that must be acceptable because it got published in a journal, and so on and so on and so on. People aren't really looking at it. So if I give another example that one has really been bugging me, and those of you who've been listening to my videos for a while, you know that this one really gets me, is looking at the book of Daniel. Okay, in the book of Daniel, Daniel says specifically that he wrote this book in the 6th century BC. He doesn't say in the 6th century. He puts himself there in the 6th century BC, in Nebuchadnezzar's time. He writes this whole thing from that perspective. Everyone believed in the church for years that is the case. Daniel was canonized part of the Old Testament a long time ago. Daniel was considered a prophet, as mentioned by even Josephus and as mentioned by Jesus, and is finally discounted later on by Jewish people who decided to demote him, probably because of his very prophetic words that spoke to Jesus, and they didn't want to believe in Jesus. Okay, I'm being very harsh to Jewish people now who don't want to believe in Jesus, but this is what happened. So then what happened was, there was a person who did not like Christians, who was a few hundred years after Jesus had walked the earth, called Porphyry. Porphyry came up with this idea that he looked at the book of Daniel and he thought that referred to somebody called Antiochus, who was around 165 BC. So he decided that there's no way that Daniel could have possibly been able to predict that. So Daniel must have written it at the same time that Antiochus was around. Antiochus Epiphanes was around. Okay, so he created a book that wrote that this is the case, that Daniel was written around 165 BC by somebody who had the knowledge of what was going to happen, because he didn't, again, like a lot of the very clear prophecies that had come true from the book of Daniel, and he didn't want to believe that it could have possibly been written in the 6th century BC. So what happened was everyone sort of ignored, the church condemned Porphyry. Nobody paid attention to him until about the 18th, 19th century. Suddenly these scholars, especially out of Germany, decided to jump on Porphyry's bandwagon and try to make the claim that Daniel was written around 165 BC. Now what happened is, today's scholarship, a lot of current scholars actually believe that Daniel was written around 165 BC. And one person might be writing something in an academic study, another person backs it up. Next thing you know, you've got this chain of events where everyone's supporting this notion that Daniel was written at that time. Essentially, taking the credibility of any Jewish people who gave and canonized the book of Daniel years ago, essentially saying that they were fools and they were duped by Daniel because Daniel really secretly wrote it during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. It's totally ridiculous. But the sad thing is a lot of scholars now today, including really good ones that I have had on my channel before, and I won't name their names, but really good people who believe that Daniel was written later, and they don't even look at the text itself, it seems to me. I have lots of reasons, lots of videos on this, so I'm not going to go too much on this tangent there. I have lots of videos on this if you want to see this in much further detail, but it's an example of how scholarship can go wrong, okay? And Lydia is exposing how scholarship can go wrong from the angle of these people's views on the Bible, which are really liberal, okay? They don't like being called liberals, but sorry, their views are extremely liberal. I'm just going to throw it out there, liberal, sorry. And this is coming from somebody who considers herself more liberal than conservative, okay? I think I'm changing my views as the more I listen to these sorts of people and this kind of thing. Sorry, guys, I'm now in the middle. I'm not going to claim either side.
Dr. Licona often articulates a principle, and as far as it goes, it's a good principle. He mentioned it again in his conclusion video, and here's approximately how that goes. Our view of the scriptures should conform itself to what we find the scriptures to be, to what we find in the scriptures and the way that God has given them. We should not try to make the scriptures conform to our preconceived ideas of what the scriptures are. Well, who could disagree with that? Certainly not I. In fact, by that same token, any good scholar can agree that we want our views of a document to correspond to what we find the document to be. But by that same token, that principle, that maxim, doesn't tell us which view of the scriptures is right. Whether the reliable historical reportage model is right, or whether the compositional device view is right. Because it just says we should make our views correspond to what we find. Well, what if what we find is that they appear to be reliable witness reportage or based at only very few removes on reliable witness reportage? Well, then we want our ideas to correspond and conform to that. In fact, that maxim doesn't even tell you which type of scholar is more likely to try to make the Gospels and the Bible and the Scriptures conform to preconceived ideas. I've argued that it's at least as likely that someone who adopts the compositional device views will make the Gospels correspond and conform to his preconceived ideas. But if you just hear that maxim, that principle, you might think that the compositional device scholars are objective. They're just taking the evidence as what it is. They're humble. They're just accepting the scriptures the way God has given them to us, and that the person who takes what we might call a more conservative view and who rejects those views is the one who's trying to force the scriptures into a box of his own making. But I've argued that that's by no means the case. From overly specific and unjustified views of the Gospels genre to what I've argued are very confused interpretations of Greek exercise books, from incorrect and overly wooden and rigid interpretations of the historian Plutarch to at least equally misguided refusals to put together gospel accounts in harmonizations that can give us a total picture of what happened. I've argued that the compositional device theories fail at every point along the line. And throughout all of those arguments, the Gospels themselves come shining through with the luster of real history upon them. Now, in Dr. Licona's series, we've heard a lot about the consensus of scholarship, the majority of scholars, what the majority of scholars think, and so forth. I would contest some of those generalizations, especially when they allegedly concern the majority of evangelical scholars, even those who are living today. But here's another point. When we consider the consensus of scholarship, we mustn't forget what G.K. Chesterton called the democracy of the dead. Just because some scholars happen to be alive at the same time that we are alive, it does not follow that they are the ones who are most likely to be right. If I could have a fantasy baseball team of defenders of the faith and biblical scholars, someone I would want on my team would be J.B. Lightfoot. Lightfoot was the Bishop of Durham. He was an English bishop in the 19th century. And here's what Lightfoot had to say about the Gospel of John. The fourth gospel is replete with historical and geographical details. It is interpenetrated with the Judaic spirit of the times. Its delineations of character are remarkably subtle. It is perfectly natural in the progress of the events. The allusions to incidents or localities or modes of thought are introduced in an artless and unconscious way, being closely interwoven with the texture of the narrative, while throughout the author has exercised a silence and a self-restraint about his assumed personality, which is without parallel in ancient forgeries. And yet, John's Gospel is the one that comes in for the greatest amount of question on the basis of these theories. It's supposedly even less historical than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, though supposedly they also took historical liberties. We could also consider the words of the Johannine scholar Leon Morris, who only died in 2006. Here was something he said about the Gospel of John. It seems to me that John is a greater figure than has been reckoned with. He is so supremely master of the situation and the tradition that he is able to bring out his essential point without distorting the facts. Many recent critics have found it impossible to believe this. They have reasoned that he must have been ready to distort facts, for his concern was with the interpretation of the facts, not with historical accuracy. This a priori approach should be firmly rejected. John tells us that he is bearing witness, and his testimony should be taken with the utmost seriousness. And I could do no better than to conclude this video and this series with some further words of Leon Morris about God and history and the Gospels. This is of the essence of the matter as the New Testament writers understood the faith. It was bold, and for most of the ancient world, a novel doctrine that God had willed to reveal himself in history. In fact, so bold a conception is this that sometimes men still shrink from its implications. It is difficult to resist the conclusion that some scholars have feared to trust God to history. The world of history is such an uncertain world. It is safer to rescue God from the whole world of history. However, God has preferred to reveal himself in the historical, and it is there that we must find him. I'm Lydia McGrew. You can contact me by emailing me at lydiamcgrew@gmail.com. Just introduce yourself a little bit when you write. Tell me a little bit about yourself. And you can also follow my public content on Facebook. Look me up on Facebook. I'll be the one in the red dress. Thanks for watching.
So I'm going to make a comment here, come back to you guys. I've been trying to get my phone to recognize the fact that I've been trying to respond to the chat because I saw a question by Susan and I wasn't able to get back to it. So I'm going to come back into the chat really quickly. Wonderful presentation by Lydia McGrew right there. I'm sure you guys all enjoyed it. Yes, I did finish The Mirror and the Mask. And so I'd highly recommend everybody watch that, read that book, I should say. It's written by Lydia McGrew. I am going to be interviewing Lydia again on my channel. She's been on my channel a few times, but I'm having her on Tuesday, in case you're interested, Tuesday at 2 o'clock Eastern. So 2 o'clock Eastern, I'll be interviewing Lydia. We're going to talk about her whole series because this was the 7th video of a 7-video series that she's written on The Mirror and the Mask, talking about like she said, the reportage model. And I am a complete advocate of the reportage model. I feel that the Gospels and the Bible itself was written through God, and they are the words of God. And so I feel that that's really important. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this now. I want to mention something. When I started this video, I don't actually know when I started this video. I was downstairs in my house. I was trying to get it set up. I had a problem with the original link on this video. So I was trying to set up a new link, and apparently it started playing even though I never hit go live. live. So I am going to make this private for a few minutes until the video comes up, so I can delete that portion of the video that you don't need to see me walking through my house and putting on lipstick and any of that kind of stuff. You don't need to see that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that after this. So I want to say thank you, everybody, for coming in here. Please like and subscribe. I'm also going to be on here tomorrow, 4 o'clock with G-Man, and we're going to be discussing, we're going to be reviewing the Inspiring Philosophy Jim Majors video. And so if you'd like to see our review on that, please tune in at 4 o'clock. It should be pretty fun times right there. And then again on Tuesday, I'll have Lydia on, and if upcoming debates or chats I'm going to have is I'm going to have Michael Heiser on my channel on September 17th. So again, please like, subscribe, and do choose to come again. Oh, this is strange. Now I don't see where I can end this stream, just like I didn't see where it began. Oh boy, I don't see a way to end the stream. Okay. I don't have an end stream button here. All right. I'm going to go ahead and try to end the stream. And you guys, thank you for coming in here. This is very strange. I don't have a way to end the stream, just like I didn't have a way to start it. It's really odd. Okay. If I just turn